Alzheimer's is another disease that has become an epidemic, and they keep saying it's expected to escalate, and they never explain why. They just say, well, it's expected to. Why is it expected to? Because they're not looking for a cure, in my opinion, and people are being put on more medications that are creating the problem. And I think it got worse after they passed the prescription drug benefit program. The only beneficiaries are the pharmaceutical companies, but because now the medications are covered by Medicare or Medicaid, more people are being put on more medications, and the pharmaceutical companies decided they're going to have to hire a lot more pharmacists, and so they're sending more through school the weekends and nights to accommodate them. But because of that, people are put on medications that are totally inappropriate. And one of the things that I discovered over and over when I'm evaluating people's medications is there's so many people are put on medications that are called contraindicated, combinations that are risky and are not recommended. But the doctors only have usually about 10 minutes with a patient, and when they've got them on several medications and got to deal with a lot of patients in a day's time, they don't have time to really evaluate it. And there's more medications constantly putting on the market. And what they tried to do is get some doctors to do a test on just the medications they prescribed. 70% refused, and the ones that did, very few of them passed it. So basically, it's one of those things that, in my opinion, maybe the pharmacist should do the prescribing instead. This is another issue, but the biggest problem I find with all conditions is medications, and I find that with Alzheimer's as well. And the other thing is foods that people are consuming now, and companies produce foods for convenience and safe. They look at taste, convenience, and like for instance in fats that a lot of people consume, they don't realize that our cells are made up of these fats. And the thing is, the fats are hydrogenated, the ones that most people consume. Well, the problem is when they hydrogenate them, that's so they'll stay on the shelf for a few years, but when they're made up, your cells are made up of these fats, they're repelling oxygen. Your cells are supposed to absorb oxygen, but instead they're repelling it, so you're not utilizing that oxygen like you should, and the receptors are not stable, so that when these different communication between neurons and stuff from the neurotransmitters are not accurate lots of times. The thing is, between that and the sweeteners that they're putting out there, and one of the worst ones that I've ever run into is aspartame or NutraSweet. It actually contains two highly stimulated amino acids, aspartic acid and phenylalanine, that can overstimulate neurons and kill them basically. And MSG is another one. It's another cytotoxin. They're putting in a flavor enhancer in a lot of foods. And the worst thing about aspartame is it contains methyl alcohol, and that's wood alcohol, which, as we know, during Prohibition times, people went blind drinking it. Well, some people do go blind if they drink enough beverage with aspartame, and it can cause multiple sclerosis and seizures. And it interacts with all medications and vaccines, aspartame does, because of the alcohol content. And it's by far the worst form of alcohol. And it converts to formaldehyde in the body, which is the reason a lot of people get autoimmune conditions from it, like MS. And with the FDA, they have 92 different conditions associated with aspartame, and they've had more complaints than all other additives put together, but it's still in the market and in about 5,000 different products. Wow. So that's just one example. But when you look at it closely, there's a good between the foods that people and beverages people are consuming now and the medications they're putting on that are depleting a whole bunch of vitamins and minerals. You start out deficient to begin with because of the diet. Most people are eating processed foods and drinking these beverages, and now they're depleting them with the different drugs they're putting them on because they all deplete vitamins and minerals, and some, quite a few of them. And so in my book on Alzheimer's, which I'll be coming out with, I've already completed it, is we talk about three different people that had Alzheimer's that were diagnosed for some time. They were actually restored back to normal again. And I kind of started out the book with that to get people, I let them know what the potential there is, because a lot of people, from all the things they hear, there's no cure, and they've been tried to produce over 100 drugs so far that have failed. And the problem is, it's the medications are a big contributor to it, and the pharmaceutical companies would not want to admit that because they're making a lot of money on those same medications, so they can't really do that. And I guarantee you they'll never find a cure in medication for Alzheimer's. But there are some things that can cure, depending on how long you've had it and what caused it. But there's one example, a guy named Abram Hoffer is actually a psychiatrist in Canada that was a contemporary of Linus Pauling, and they both were kind of into natural therapies. And he was a neat guy, but his mother, Clara, was kind of concerned because he was heading to Europe for 3 months, and she had a problem with her arthritis was getting worse, and she had trouble remembering and got confused all the time, and was at dementia pretty bad. So she wanted to know what he could do to help her. And he thought, well, I guess I'll give her a placebo because I don't have a clue what to do. So he thought, well, he said he knew that if you do niacin, if you take niacin, if you've ever taken it, you'll notice the niacin flush. It's obvious. So he thought, well, that will work as a placebo because she'll notice. So he told her to take 1,000 milligrams 3 times a day, which she did, and he took off to Europe and got a letter a couple months later. It was sounding more normal, and he wondered if somebody else wrote it or what, but by the time he got back, she was pretty much back to normal, and even her arthritis was going away. And that's all she did. And then there's another case where a guy had actually been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and his wife for 6 years had to take care of him, do everything for him, feed him, bathe him, and he couldn't do anything for himself. And within about 2 weeks, he's back to normal again. As it turned out, he had a lot of aluminum in the brain, and he had high doses of MSM that was chelating or removing that aluminum from the brain. And the thing is, mercury and aluminum and lead and all those things damage the brain. And my opinion is because they're conductors, and these conductors, all these heavy metals embed in fat tissue, which is the insulator in your neurons. And so when you got conductors and insulators, you get the cross-circuiting. But anyway, he was back to normal again. And then there's a girl named Betty Newport, and her husband Steve was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So the doctors thought, well, I guess he's kind of depressed. Well, if you're thinking you're losing your memory a little bit or something, they put him on a couple of antidepressants to begin with. And later they put him on Alzheimer's medications, and she heard of a study that she wanted to get him involved in because he was getting really bad. And he used to be really bright, and he was an accountant, and he could figure out all kinds of things, and he was very creative. And all of a sudden he got confused and forgot things, and he'd go around one shoe and a whole bunch of different things she talked about that was not typical of him originally. And she heard of a study that was going on and wanted to see if she could get him involved, and it was for Alzheimer's. And when they diagnosed him, looked at him, they said, no, he doesn't qualify, he's too bad. You know, he figured there's no way you could help him. And then she thought, well, I'm going to see what's in that. And she's a doctor, by the way, she's a pediatrician. So she discovered, well, medium chain triglycerides. Well, it just so happens coconut oil has got about 70% medium chain triglycerides. So she started giving him coconut oil, a tablespoon a couple times a day. And in a few weeks, he was getting back to normal again. And coconut oil is really good for the brain. It's an excellent source of energy for the brain. It doesn't cause fat to form like most fats do. The medium chain triglycerides process entirely different. It's an excellent source of energy for the brain. But Steve was getting back to normal again, and last I heard he was doing pretty well. And I asked her what medications did they have him on, because she said if he didn't take that coconut oil regular, he was having all these symptoms again. And it turned out that he was on some Alzheimer's medications and antidepressants that were causing, in my opinion, the symptoms he's dealing with, and I could tie him to the medication. So this is an example of what potential there is, and I've also found two different classes of medications that contribute to Alzheimer's that a lot of seniors are taking. And acetylcholine is the main neurotransmitter in the brain, and most of the people with Alzheimer's are deficient, but as it turned out, there's a class of medications that actually deplete acetylcholine, and then they put them on Alzheimer's medications, which don't, what they admit, don't reverse or slow down the process. So I don't know why you would want to give it to somebody if that's true, because they have a lot of terrible side effects, and one of them is incontinence, and then they happen to have a class of medications for incontinence that actually shuts down the receptor for acetylcholine, and then you're going to get worse. So when you look at these things scientifically, rather than promotional from pharmaceutical companies that are always trying to find a positive, something positive that they're really not doing any good, and lots of times doing a lot of damage. And you find that most doctors read medical journals that are written by ghostwriters for the pharmaceutical company to put a positive light on their drugs, and they will never say anything negative. And then the company that will buy up maybe 10,000 copies and give it to pharmaceutical reps to pass around to doctors, and they never in these medical journals hear anything positive about anything natural, and the drugs always sound like they're the greatest, and this is what a lot of doctors rely on. And another thing they rely on is the physician's desk reference, and I have a current one. It's about 3,600 pages of fine print with a lot of technical terms that the pharmaceutical companies put out for their drugs. So they're required to do it, but no doctor is ever going to read it, so it's basically useless. So we've spent a lot of time putting together comprehensive information on the 250 so far most prescribed medications. Easy to read, understand, show that all the different vitamins and minerals are being depleted, the medication side effects, and the contraindications or risky combinations. And like I mentioned, this is over and over we find that doctors are constantly prescribing drugs that are contraindicated, that are risky, that are not supposed to be, but they don't have time in the 10-minute office call that they're typically allowed, and because a lot of the clinics are pressuring them to run them through because they make more money. And so the doctors don't have time, and they keep coming out with more drugs all the time, and it's impossible for them to keep up with it, and they don't have time to really evaluate the medications they're prescribing, and so that's another issue. But I just want you to know that there is potential for resolving Alzheimer's or preventing it, and the objective is to prevent it. But if you haven't prevented it, if it isn't, in some cases, like I mentioned, that look like they're pretty much a lost cause, turned out weren't lost cause. So this gives you some idea of what the potential there is. But so far, from my experience over the years, if you want to cure anything, don't look for a drug for the solution, because they admit they don't prevent or cure disease. And if your objective is to prevent or cure disease, you've got to find some natural therapy. And in my opinion, that's the only way it's going to happen. And frankly, like 55 years ago, I was majored in psychology at the University of Oregon. And at nearly 79, my brain is a lot more efficient than it was back then. So there is potential, and you just have to realize that there's things we can do, and there's supplements you can take that enhance your memory, and things that connect both hemispheres to your brain so you can retain information better. It's sort of like a photographic memory. You use the right brain along with the left brain more, which I find that does happen. So there's so much we can do, and it's not a lost cause, and you'd be amazed at the potential there is. So.
Okay, could you tell me, besides niacin, MSM, and coconut oil, is there any other things that get rid of the Alzheimer's that you can think of just offhand?
Yeah, there's phosphatidylcholine and phosphatidylserine and essential fatty acids, the good fats, and a good B complex, and actually vitamin B12 is a big one. Most people are deficient in B12, especially the elderly. Some of them have to do injections because they don't absorb it, or do sublingual under the tongue, you absorb it. But otherwise, B6, B12, and folic acid are all really important because that controls homocysteine. And homocysteine actually can damage the nerves in the brain, and it can damage the arteries and cause arterial problems. So that's a big one, and you never hear them talk about that. They talk about cholesterol, and I might mention cholesterol's never ever been a problem, and if your cholesterol's too low, you could end up with Alzheimer's from that. And matter of fact, they finally did admit this just recently on the news, that if your cholesterol's too low, the cholesterol medications can contribute to both diabetes and Alzheimer's. And I've been saying it for a long time, because your body produces cholesterol when it needs it, and if you're stressed, your cholesterol level goes up because it produces stress hormones. And if your blood vessels are leaky because your thyroid is low, it's going to produce more until you resolve that. So there's a good reason. God knew what he was doing. There's no such thing as bad cholesterol, never has been. But they ignored that, the homocysteine issue, because you can't fix it with a drug. So for years they hid it. And Kilmer McCulley, about 35 years ago, discovered it was not cholesterol but homocysteine, and they threatened to pull his funding. And if he published, he did publish. He not only pulled his funding, but he couldn't get a job for about 5 years. But he was proven right later, and yet most doctors never talk about homocysteine. They just keep focused on cholesterol, which never was a problem. But there's several different things in my book. I talk about some formulas I'm aware of. Cognitex is one by for Life Extension Foundation, but you find formulas that have quite a few of those things in combination. And so there's just, I talk about brain enhancers, and that's one of them. And pyroglutamate is another one, arginine pyroglutamate, and that's the one that connects both of the hemispheres of your brain, as well as stimulates acetylcholine. It somehow manages to build a connection between the right and left hemisphere. And when you stop to think about it, we're wasting a lot of our brain at times because we're not utilizing them. Like artists use the right brain a lot more, and I'm more logical and use the left brain, but I find that by connecting the other hemisphere, I can remember things by visually more than I used to. I can kind of see a page and pretty much see where, when I'm looking for something, I know what it looks like and about where on the page it's at, and that type of thing. So that does help. And so there's just all kinds of things we can do, and I cover quite a bit of detail on some of those things in my book on Taking the Mystery Out of Alzheimer's. So it's not such a big mystery, just like a lot of diseases. Once you look at them closely, scientifically, it's called evidence-based medicine. They got different terms, but look at what works, and I guarantee you, the closer you look at the medications, the worse the problem is. And it's, now I've got proof of it, and that's what people really need to know, because even the doctors prescribing these medications aren't that familiar with them. And in my opinion, the pharmacist should do the prescribing, because that's their specialty and they're more knowledgeable. And that'd take a responsibility away from the doctors, and so they could do the tests, and the pharmacists that could fill the prescriptions. And I know a guy named Armin Neal. It was an article in AERP where he was able to get the seniors off of half or more of their medications at the senior care facilities, and he said they did better, less hospitalizations, and he said they weren't even appropriate, and he's a pharmacist. And so I can go further, and nutrition-wise, replace most of them. And Susie Cohen's a pharmacist that actually finds solutions lots of times that are natural too instead. So it's getting out there. More and more doctors are saying it, and so I think you'll find in the future that people are going to realize that the drugs aren't the solution, never have been, and never will be. So that's my opinion. And just remember that it's not a lost cause. I don't care what condition you have. I'm convinced there's a cure for any disease. Just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it isn't out there. It means we need to keep looking. But in most of the common ones I'm familiar with, there are cures, and they're not that complex, and they're always a natural solution. So that's my opinion on Alzheimer's.